this is something I want people to take really seriously, is I was a White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. It's a conservative outlet in Washington during the Trump years. And the most important thing I learned from that was that under the White House Correspondents Association, the way that the media cartel has everything set up for access for press to the president is fundamentally broken, anti-American, and bad for actual democracy. So let me lay this out at a very mechanical level because nobody knows this. And I was a former White House Correspondents Association member. So anybody who says I'm full of shit, I was there. For example, number one, all the seats in the briefing room. Those seats are assigned by the White House Correspondents Association, not by the White House itself. The White House Correspondents Association requires you to apply for a seat, right? That adjudication process can take literally years for bylaws, elections, and all these things to do. This means that they can slow roll the entrance of new media, online outlets who are allowed into the room. The reason it really matters not having a seat is if you don't have a seat, you have to get there early and stand in the wings like I used to and raise your hand like this and just hope and pray that the press secretary can see. It's extremely inconvenient. I'm talking, I have to get there hours early at a chance during a 15-minute briefing. So one of the things is that Trump has is he owes a huge part of his election to coming on podcasts and to new media. Now, because of that, it's really important that the White House Correspondents Association, which is a literal guild cartel that keeps people out of the White House and credentials itself and creates this opaque mechanism through which they control access, to asking the press secretary questions, is destroyed. And there are a lot of different ways you can do this because what nobody gets too is that all of these rules are unofficial. So for example, they're just traditions. The White House is like, yeah, it's our building, but you guys figure it out, right? Because that's a long-standing tradition. Let me give you another insane tradition that currently exists in the White House. The Associated Press, the White press secretary or the Associated Press correspondent gets to start the briefing traditionally. They get the first question. They also get to end the briefing. When they think it's been enough time, they'll be like, okay, Corinne Jean-Pierre, thank you, right? And that calls the briefing over. What? Who? You're not even the White House Correspondents Association. You literally just happen to work for the Associated Press. Why? Why do we allow that to happen? So number one, stop doing that. To their credit, the Trump people didn't really do that, but it's a longstanding tradition. The other thing is that what nobody gets either is that the first row is all television networks for logistical reasons, so that they can do their little stand-ups with their mic and say, I'm reporting live for the White House. Well, what people don't seem to know is that all the television networks are basically going to ask some version of the same question. The reason they do that is because they need a clip of their correspondent going after the White House press secretary about Robert Mueller, like whenever I was there. So you get the same goddamn version of the stupid political questions over and over again. The briefing room is designed for traditional media, and they have all the access in the world. So in an election where you owe your victory to, at least in part, to new media and recognizing the changing landscape, you need to change the conduit of information to the American people. And in an election, I don't know if you saw this, but election night coverage on cable news was down 25%. Just in 4 years, 25%. That's astounding. That's cable news had a monopoly on election night for my entire lifetime. And yet my show had record ratings that night. And I'm a small slice of the puzzle here. We've got Candace Owens, Patrick Bet-David, Tim Pool, David Pakman, TYT, all these other people. From what I understand, all of us blew it out that night because millions of Americans watched it on YouTube. We even partnered with some Decision Desk HQ. So we had live data. We could make state calls. And we're just a silly little YouTube show. My point, though, is that in an election where the vast majority of Americans under the age of 55 are listening to podcasts, consuming new media, and are not watching cable news, where the median age of CNN, which is the youngest viewership, is 68. 68 is the median. So statistically, what does that tell us? All right, there's a decent number of people who are watching CNN who are in their 80s and in their 90s. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Alex because he deserves a tremendous shout out. Alex Brusewitz, he was the pioneer of the podcast strategy for the Donald J. Trump campaign. He got on your show. He was able to get on Andrew Schultz's show, Rogan. He was the internal force that pushed a lot of this. My personal hope is that somebody like Alex is elevated in the traditional White House bureaucracy, that the number of credentials that are issued to these mainstream media outlets is cut, and there is a new lottery process put in place where people with large audiences are invited. And I also want to make a case here for why I think it's really important for people like you and others who don't have as much traditional media experience to come in and practice some capital J journalism, because it will sharpen you too, giving you access in that pressure cooker environment and having to really like sit there and spar a little bit with a public official and not have as long necessarily as you're used to. It really hones your news media skills, your news gathering skills, and it will make you a better interviewer in the long run. Because a lot of the things that I have learned have just been through osmosis. I've just lived in DC. I've been so lucky. I've had a lot of cool jobs, and I've just been able to experience a lot of this stuff. So I'm really hoping that people who are listening to this, who may have some influence or even the viewership, if you want to, reach out to them and all them, this is a very easily changeable problem. It's a cartel which has no official power. It's all power by tradition, and it needs to be blown up. It does not serve America's interests to have 48 seats, I think, in the White House press briefing room to people who have audiences of like 5. It just makes absolutely zero. Workspace, seats, access credentials, and also credentials that are issued to press and to other like new media journalists at major events should take precedence. Because it's not even about rewarding the creator. The American people are here. You need to meet them. That's your job. And I'll just end with a historical thing. Barack Obama shocked the White House press corps in 2009 because he took a question from the Huffington Post, a brand new blog, but they were stunned because he knew. He said, these blog people, they went all in for me and I got to reward them. So there's longstanding precedence of this. They'll bitch and they'll moan, they'll be upset, but it's their fault, that they don't have as much credibility. And it's incumbent upon the White House, which serves the public, to actually meet them where they are. So I really hope that at least some of this is implemented inside of there.
Yeah, if you break apart the cartel, I think you can actually enable greater journalism, frankly, with a capital J. Because actually in the long form is when you can do better journalism from even just the politician perspective. You can disagree, you can get criticized because you can defend yourself.
I had an idea, actually. Tell me what you think. I think a really cool format would be there's a room right near the press briefing room called the Roosevelt Room. Beautiful room, by the way. It's awesome. It has the Medal of Honor for Teddy Roosevelt, and it has a portrait of him and a portrait of FDR. It's one of my favorite rooms in the White House. Yeah. It's so cool. And so my idea would be in the Roosevelt Room, which is traditionally used for press briefings and stuff, is like you, as the press secretary, sit there. I think there's like 12 seats, something like that. And you set it all up and you have, let's say, Shure microphones like this. And that person, that secretary, is going to commit to being there for like 2 hours. And new media people like can sit around the room. All of this being streamed live, by the way, just like the White House press briefing room. But the expectation is that the type of questions have to be substantive. Obviously, nothing is off limits. You should never, ever, accept, I'm not going to ask about this. Especially as a journalist, you can't do that. Every time they're like, hey, please don't ask about this. It's like, actually, that's probably the one thing you should ask about. But my point being that the expectation is that there's no interference on the White House side, but that the format itself will lend exactly to what you're saying to allow people to explain. And again, in a media era where we need to trust the consumer, like my show is routinely over 2 hours long. On cable television, the Tucker Carlson program, whenever it was on Fox News, without commercial breaks was about 42, 43 minutes, something like that of runtime. So I'm speaking for almost triple what that is on a regular basis. The point is that millions are willing to sit and to listen, but you just have to meet them where they are. So I would really hope that a format like that, like a streamer briefing or something like that, I think it's, look, I know they would dunk on it endlessly, but I think it could work.
Yeah, I think the incentives are different. I think it works because you don't have to, like you, Saagar, don't have to signal to the other journalists that you're part of the clique.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because that was another lesson I learned. I go, oh, none of you are asking important questions for the people. You're asking questions because you all hang out with each other. And you're like, oh, wait, so this entire thing is a self-reinforcing guild to impress each other at cocktail parties and not to actually ask anything interesting. I remember people were so mad at me because this was 2018 or maybe 2017. And I said, do you think that Kim Jong-un is sincere in his willingness to meet with you? something like that, to that effect. They were furious because I didn't ask about some bullshit political controversy that was happening at the time. So in the historical legacy, what was more important? The Mueller question or Donald Trump breaking 50 years or whatever of tradition with America's relationship with North Korea and meeting him in Singapore and basically resetting that relationship for all time? As you can tell, I read a lot of books. I like to take the long view. Every time I would ask a question, I go, okay, when the future Robert Caro is writing books and he's reading the transcript of the White House press briefing, he doesn't even know who this kid is. He goes, oh, that was a pretty good question right there. That's pretty relevant. You know, you got to think about all the bullshit that gets left on the cutting room floor.
I love that view of journalism. Actually, the goal is to end up as one line in a history book. 50 years from now.
I just want a quote of what the president said to something that I asked in a book. I would be happy. I would die happy with that. If you told me that when I'm like a 90-year-old man, I'd be like, man, that means I succeeded.
When the AIs write the history of human civilization.